Professor Michael Semple is from the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice at Queen's University Belfast, and he joins us now live. Thanks so much, Dave, for being with us on the programme today. So, details coming through of this new interim government. We now know it'll be led by Mullah Mohammed Hassan Arkhand, with Taliban co-founder Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar as deputy. What do we know about them? What do you think they will be like in those roles?
Well, I should say that the announcement that we've just had is fascinating for Taliban watchers, because all the names on the list, including these two that you mentioned at the top, are extremely familiar. Not just to people who have been following the Taliban during the past few years of insurgency, but even to those of us like myself who worked as international officials in Afghanistan between 1996 and 2001. These were the same people who were there then. So we know Mullah Hassan from that period. He was the head of the Council of Ministers from 96 to 2001. He returns to that position. He's got almost no public profile. He's not really, he's not known to people outside the circle of Taliban and Taliban watchers. He's got no experience in politics beyond chairing some meetings beside his fellow Taliban. In terms of Mullah Baradar, I mean, at least over the past 3 years, he's had some exposure to the rest of the country, the rest of the world, apart from Taliban meetings. But I think one of the interesting things about Mullah Baradar is that reality will sink in for people now that the international diplomats thought that they were dealing with a powerhouse inside the Taliban when they sat down with Mullah Baradar and they listened to all his reassurances about how well the Taliban will govern. But now that the Taliban actually have power in their hands, they find that Mullah Baradar is not the top dog. He is at best, he is a second dog. He answers to somebody who is much more conservative, much more hardline than himself.
And another figure I'd like to mention is the new acting Interior Minister, who heads up a militant group linked to the Taliban. What do you make of his appointment?
Well, I mean, this really should come as a shock for people who thought that the Taliban were going to go out of their way to form an inclusive administration which would be designed in such a way to deal with the international community. I mean, it's almost a slap in the face for people who were involved in sort of counter-terrorism efforts. Now, that's not just the Americans, that's also the Afghan people. The Khalifa Siraj, who's come in as acting Interior Minister, he was formerly the coordinator of the suicide operations undertaken by his group. He is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Afghans in suicide bombs directed against civilian targets inside Kabul, as well as hundreds of deaths in international forces who were also separately targeted. And he's not the only person. If you look further down the list, Deputy Intelligence Minister is somebody who was specifically the head of one of the suicide bomber cells, sort of financed and directed by Siraj Haqqani. So to be shifting from running covert camps across the border in Pakistan, be brought into Kabul, now to be running part of the intelligence service is a remarkable transformation. And frankly, it is a deliberate act of provocation. They absolutely know that this will provoke the international community as well as their own people.
Why do you think at this stage this is an announcement of an interim government rather than a full government?
Well, during the Taliban's period in power in the late 90s, they also constituted themselves as an interim government. So I think it's a sensible recognition that this has all been put together very quickly, as was the administration that they imposed in the late 90s. So it's sort of, I think at least that is a token recognition of what's going on. But there's another very interesting thing about this administration, which perhaps explains why they have announced it as a caretaker. There's no head of state. Specifically, Mullah Hassan, as was his role in the 1990s. He's head of executive, not the head of state. They're absolutely silent on who's the head of state. Now, in the last time round, the Taliban emir, supposedly they're rightly guided by God, the emir of all the faithful, then Mullah Umar, he is he sort of took the role that normally would go to the head of state, whether it be the king, as was in the previous Afghan constitution, or subsequently president. Now, they haven't announced any such position this time, and everybody's noticed that it's 3 weeks after this glorious victory over the former government and the Americans, and nobody has heard, has heard or seen anything from the person who's meant to be the supreme leader. So basically, it looks like there's a vacancy at the top of the Taliban movement for the person who would be the head of state. So if you can't even name a head of state, of course your administration has to be acting. But I think that some of the sort of the wiser people in the Taliban movement will probably want to put out signals that this is not the end of the story. They have resolutely refused to bring in a single person from outside the movement, so that all the talk about an inclusive administration which might enjoy the support of the population after the war, I mean, that just has come to nothing so far. So I think that they will want to hold out the prospect that maybe in the future, when we get round to it, when the time is right, when we have an agreement, perhaps we can actually move towards an inclusive administration. But for the moment, this is named as being a caretaker and acting administration, but it is absolutely not inclusive. It is the most exclusive administration you could imagine.
Professor Michael Semple from Queen's University Belfast, thanks very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you.